The purpose of this video is to talk about how we might reinvent Christian practices. We're going to talk about four things: why we reinvent practices, how to reinvent practices, give an extended example of reinventing practices, and then give some short teaser examples of ways of other kinds of practices we might reinvent. The first question is, why do we reinvent practices? We reinvent practices because we want to point people to Jesus, but we want to remain anchored in the Christian faith. We recognize that as we point people to Jesus and we remain anchored in the faith, we're going to be doing the things that people have done for generations. But we want to do them in such a way that they speak to this generation. We understand that things are going to have to speak to new generations. Think about the practice of worship. Practice of worship looks very different today than it did 20 years ago or 50 years ago, and not to mention 100 years ago or back when they did Gregorian chants. Every Christian community practices worship, but every Christian community, every generation of Christian communities has to reinvent it for themselves so that the practices are rooted in the Christian faith, but we reinvent them to speak to this generation's questions. How then do we go about reinventing practices? We do it through four steps. First, we listen to the longings and losses of your people. Everything that we do, the reason that we reinvent is because we want to speak to the needs of the people entrusted to our care. Next, we think about the big lie that your people believe. Think about it. What I mean by big lie, it's a phrase that comes from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement used to say that at the core of the civil rights, core of Jim Crow, the core of the problem on the American South is the idea that some people are worth more than other people. That's a big lie. And no one would speak the big lie out loud. That's the whole point of big lies. No one would say them out loud, but you believed it and you acted it. The way that then you refute it is by finding a way to speak it out loud and connect it to the Christian faith. So in this particular case, in the civil rights movement, what they would do is they would connect it to the idea that we are all created in the image of God. And if we are all created in the image of God, no one is worth more than the other person. Can you see how once we identify the big lie, it allows us to name how it violates the gospel. And once we do that, it bursts the lie and it no longer has its power. And then the fourth thing is go back to the biblical roots and historical experience in order to think about how we might connect up that practice to the long-standing way in which the community of faith is practicing. Let me give you an example on this. I want to give an extended example focused on reinventing hospitality. So the first thing is we start with the people entrusted to our care. When we're working on hospitality, the reason that we're working on hospitality is because every person, every human being has a longing for community. But community is often built around insiders and outsiders. That's the whole point, is everyone in the community is one of us and everybody's not in the community is not one of us. The whole idea of hospitality is to invite outsiders into the community or to treat them like people who are already in the community. But there's a couple of big lies that prevent us from extending this kind of community to others. The first is that we believe that in order to belong, you have to become like us. Oftentimes at churches that we know, if somebody comes in from the outside who's never been in church, we expect them to dress like us, to talk like us, to think like us, to be able to look like us and practice like us, and then we can say you belong in the community. But if you come into our community wearing the wrong clothes or swearing in the wrong place or living with somebody or whatever it is that you're doing, we often tell people that in order to become one of us, you have to stop being like other people and start acting like us. Hospitality says that we need to invite people into the community even before they become like us. And to get at that, I want to distinguish between two words: assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is the idea that in order to come into a community, the outsider has to change to become like the insider, and then they are worthy and ready to become like the insider, like one of us. I want to distinguish that from to think about accommodation. Accommodation is different than assimilation. Accommodation is the idea that the insider is the one that will change in order to welcome somebody into their community. Let me think of it this way. Jesus in the incarnation left heaven and came and lived among us. He was the one that changed in order to make it possible for us to be part of God's family, in order to belong to God. The incarnation is an act of hospitality in that he decided to invite us in. He decided to make us joint heirs with him. So the first big lie is to belong, you have to become like us. The second big lie is the idea that hospitality is only for good guests. People often ask me, when we talk about hospitality, what about taking advantage of? What about people who are bad guests, who will take advantage of us? Don't we have to recognize that we can't practice hospitality in a way that gets us taken advantage of? At this point, I want to point to God. Remember, we've already talked before about how God is the first one that practiced hospitality. God created a world for us. God created this world that was pristine, and he invited us into it, and that at some point we messed it up. We human beings messed it up, and we continue to mess it up. It's not just that Adam and Eve or some forebears messed it up. I participate in messing it up every single day. So the only way I can ask about whether or not bad guests deserve hospitality is if I pretend that I'm a good guest. The fact of the matter is I'm the bad guest. I'm the one who has messed up what God has done. And if I'm the bad guest, I can't turn around and say that I will only practice hospitality with good guests. If God made room for me, then I have to make room for others. And that leads us to the third point. God calls us to welcome people who are not like us because God accommodated us. We are to act as God acted. The theologian Miroslav Volf would talk about how if it weren't for sin, we would be like God in the way that baby bears are like mama bears. We would practice hospitality in just the way God practiced hospitality because we've learned by watching God. That's why we have to, that's the way we refute the big lie. We look to the Bible for examples. Abraham, lots of different examples of hospitality and eating and meals in Abraham's life. Rahab the spy welcomed the welcomed the Hebrew spies. We have the idea of Elijah and Elisha receiving hospitality. We have Jesus eating with sinners and tax collectors. And the Pharisees reviled him for it because they understood that he wasn't just simply eating with them. He was identifying with them. He was treating them like insiders. And the Pharisees wanted to say, no, we are the ones that have tried to become like you. We are the ones that deserve. We are the good guests. We are the ones that you should be eating with, not these sinners and tax collectors. They're the bad guests. Don't do that. We have examples from Lydia. We have all sorts of examples from Scripture. But the whole idea of reinventing hospitality is to extend privilege across difference. Let's look at some different kinds of privileges. There's smart privilege. I mean, we all know that in the schools and in all sorts of places, smart kids get treated better than kids that aren't smart. Musical privilege. Musical kids are able to do lots of things that other kids are. Rich privilege, athletic privilege, white privilege, the idea that I get treated better at times because I am white. If I walk into a store, I am not worried about the store owner wondering, am I there to steal something? If I was an African American and I walked into the exact same store, sometimes people are going to welcome me and sometimes people are going to wonder if I'm there to steal something. There's white privilege. There's male privilege. When I was a kid, I was somebody who took charge and did a lot of stuff, and they patted me on the head and said, yes, you're a leader, and they reinforced that. If my sister had done the exact same thing, they would have called her bossy. They would have done the opposite of reinforce it. They would have tried to trim it out of her. And then idea of Christian privilege. There's this sense that when somebody comes into our communities of faith, do they know what a Bible is or what passages are? They don't know the lingo. They don't know. There's ways in which, as insiders, we already have privilege when we are at church. We need to be able to extend privilege across difference. Let me give you 3 examples of how that might play out. I have a friend who's a vegetarian. She came for dinner last week. When she came to dinner at our house, we did not serve steak. Why? Because we had listened to her long enough to understand her, and we accommodated ourselves to her in order to welcome her. I didn't become a vegetarian, but for that night, in a way that welcomed her, I became a vegetarian. Or let me tell you about a story about Reuben and Sonia. Reuben and Sonia were about 25 years old. They were homeless people, were living in a van with their baby, and they came to my particular church, and they asked for help with food. The woman that's in charge of it, a woman named Carol at our church, what she did is she listened to them and she gave them some vouchers for food. She helped them to get into temporary housing, but then she listened to them. And she noticed that when they went out to the van where they were living, she saw a bass, and Reuben played bass. And so this was on a Friday, and she said, "Won't you come to church on Sunday? And Reuben, will you play in our praise band?" She didn't ask anybody. She just told Reuben to show up, and then she called up the person in charge of the praise band and said, "There might be a bass player that shows up." She didn't ask if he was a good musician. She didn't even ask if he was a good Christian. She invited him in. And why is that treating an outsider like an insider? Let's say we had a 25-year-old in our particular church who had grown up in the church who played bass. We'd be craving trying to get him into the praise band. What she did is she just skipped all those steps and said, "We're going to treat you like an insider." And what happened? It's 2 years later now, and Reuben and Sonia are members of our community, of our church. They teach in Sunday school. Reuben plays regularly in the praise band. Their child is growing up as a part of it. They are insiders. The very act of inviting, the act of treating them treating an outsider like an insider, eventually turned them into insiders. And the other example is your young people. There are lots of places where they are insiders. Every young person you know, they're either smart or musical or athletic, or they're good at whatever they like. They like Marvel comics. Whatever it is that they know, there's video games. Whatever it is, they are an insider on something. Play up that insiderness and then help them learn how to invite others to boundaries beyond that. How do we deal with reinventing Christian practices? We talked about why we reinvent them. We talked about how to reinvent them. We talked about an example of hospitality. And now let me give you some short teaser examples. Examples. Think of Sabbath as a healthy rhythm of labor and rest, where we think about what's a great way to teach labor to the people entrusted to our care. We've talked about testimony as narrating one's life according to the contours of the gospel. What is it that we might do to help young people narrate their lives even when it's hard and difficult? Lament. We can think about crying out to God to say that things are not the way that they should be. Think about the people entrusted to your care. If there are young people that are entrusted to your care, they have all sorts of ways in which life is hard as a young person. Adolescence is hard. Help them lament. If there are older people entrusted to your care, senior citizens, there are all sorts of ways in which life is hard. Help them lament. Figure out ways in which they can articulate their longing and crying out to God. We have lots of examples of how we can engage in reinventing Christian practices. That's the work that we need to do.